I watched a grown man sign a check for $22,000 with the same hand that had been reaching into my mailbox for weeks. And I'll never forget how quiet he got when he realized nobody had tricked him. Nobody had set him up. He'd walked himself into every single problem because he was so convinced he already knew how the story was supposed to end. His wife wouldn't even look at me. She just stared down at the paperwork while the notary slid the last page across the table. And standing there on my front porch with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, I remember thinking that pride has probably cost more people money than bad luck ever has. My name is Mason Cole. I'm 44 years old, and after practicing civil litigation for almost 15 years, I retired earlier than anyone expected because somewhere along the way, I realized I was spending more time arguing about life than actually living it. I sold my firm, bought 6 quiet acres just outside Lexington, Kentucky, and started keeping bees. Most people hear that and picture some old guy wearing overalls with straws sticking out of his pockets. But the truth is beekeeping is more organized than most law offices I've worked in. Bees don't waste energy pretending to be something they're not. They don't gossip. They don't file complaints because somebody else's flowers bloom first. And they definitely don't wake up every morning looking for someone to blame for their own unhappiness. My place wasn't fancy, weathered cedar siding, a wraparound porch, white fencing that had seen better days, and rows of wildflowers stretching toward the tree line where more than 200 hives quietly did what they'd been doing long before I got there. It was peaceful in a way I didn't know I needed until I finally had it. And for almost 3 years, nobody bothered anybody. Then the Harper family moved in next door, and peace suddenly became something I had to defend. Their house looked like it belonged on the cover of an architecture magazine. All clean white stone, giant black windows, perfectly trimmed landscaping that somehow never had a single weed, and a brand new electric SUV sitting in the driveway almost every afternoon. I don't have anything against people with money. I used to make plenty myself, but there are people who buy expensive houses because they appreciate them. And there are people who buy expensive houses because they think the price gives them authority over everyone nearby. Ethan Harper was definitely the second kind. The first time we met, he smiled, shook my hand, looked over my shoulder at the bee yards, and said, "Hope those aren't going to be a problem." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of sentence someone says when they've already decided they're right. I laughed a little and told him the bees had been there for years. The county knew about them. My agricultural exemption had been on record forever, and nobody had ever had an issue. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "sometimes people don't know they have a problem until someone points it out." I should have recognized that tone. I'd heard it in courtrooms for years. It was the voice of someone who confused confidence with competence. Over the next month, we barely spoke, but I started noticing little things. He'd stand near the property line with his phone out, taking pictures of my hives. He'd measure distances with one of those laser gadgets. Sometimes I'd catch him watching while I unloaded honey supers into my pickup, making notes on a tablet like he was building a file. At first, I honestly thought maybe he was just curious. Then our mail carrier, Linda, who'd been delivering to my road longer than I'd lived there, casually asked if I'd been expecting important paperwork because she'd noticed my mailbox hanging open twice that week. I told her I hadn't left it open, and she frowned in that way people do when they know something's wrong but don't want to accuse anybody without proof. A few days later, I realized one of my state agriculture inspection notices never arrived. Then a distributor invoice disappeared. Then my organic certification paperwork, the original copy with the raised seal, simply vanished. That one bothered me. Replacing it wasn't impossible, but it wasn't quick either. I searched the house, the truck, the workshop, everywhere. Nothing. 2 mornings later, I walked past the Harper's trash bins sitting near the curb waiting for pickup, and a folded cream-colored document caught my eye through the partially open lid. I shouldn't have looked, but something told me to stop. I lifted the lid just enough to see the embossed state seal stained with dried coffee across the corner. My paperwork, my original certification. Somebody had opened my mail, taken what they wanted, and tossed the rest away like it was junk. I carried it home without saying a word, set it on the kitchen table, and watched the security footage from the camera facing my driveway. The first clip showed Ethan walking past my mailbox while pretending to take an evening stroll. The second showed him stopping, glancing toward my house, opening the mailbox, and pulling out envelopes. The third was impossible to explain away. 4 separate recordings over 6 days, each one clearer than the last. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my eyes, and actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because after 15 years practicing law, I knew exactly what he had just done. And I had a feeling he didn't. If you think that was the biggest mistake he made, trust me, it was only the beginning. The funny thing about spending half your career in court is that people assume lawyers love conflict. Most of us don't. We just learn to recognize the exact moment when someone crosses a line they don't even realize exists, and watching Ethan open my mailbox wasn't satisfying because I caught him. It was satisfying because I finally understood what game he thought he was playing. He wasn't trying to steal my mail because he cared about my invoices. He wanted evidence. Every distributor receipt, every agriculture document, every shipping label, every piece of paperwork with a company name on it fit the story he'd already written in his head. He believed I was secretly running a commercial business in a residential area, and if he collected enough documents, he'd convince the county to shut my apiary down. The problem was that he had never bothered checking whether his story matched reality. My property had been protected under an agricultural grandfather exemption since the late 70s, years before either of us had ever seen this neighborhood. It didn't matter if I had 1 hive or 500. Everything I was doing was completely legal, but I wasn't about to march next door waving county records and start yelling across the fence. That's what he expected. People like Ethan feed on arguments because arguments give them attention. Quiet preparation is something they never see coming. The next morning I drove to the county clerk's office, partly to print another copy of my exemption records, partly because old habits die hard. Lawyers don't stop digging just because they retire. While waiting for one file to print, I started browsing neighboring property permits out of simple curiosity. That's when one document caught my eye. Harper Residence, Wastewater System Permit. Status, pending. I frowned. New construction permits usually don't sit pending for 8 months unless something complicated is holding them up. I requested the file, thanked the clerk, and carried the folder to one of the reading tables. About 20 minutes later, I found the sentence that changed everything. Their engineered drain field crossed approximately 12 feet of my property before connecting with the approved absorption area. The builder had submitted a proposed easement, but no signed easement had ever been recorded. I read it again just to be sure. Without my signature, the county could never finalize that portion of the installation. Technically, the system functioned, but legally it was incomplete, and if the county ever enforced the permit conditions, rerouting the entire field around my land would require excavation through rock and mature trees. The engineer's estimate, attached to the application, placed that cost somewhere between $90,000 and $100,000, depending on groundwater conditions. I leaned back and let out a slow breath. That wasn't revenge. That was leverage. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional. Leverage is contractual. I folded the paperwork, thanked the clerk again, and drove home thinking about something one of my old law partners used to say: never interrupt someone while they're creating their own liability. Ethan was doing an excellent job of that without any help from me. Before making another move, I called the United States Postal Inspection Service and filed a formal report. The inspector who answered sounded calm, almost bored at first, until I mentioned I had multiple high-definition recordings showing someone intentionally opening my mailbox and removing federal mail. His tone changed immediately. He asked me to upload every clip, every timestamp, every photograph of the recovered documents. Don't contact him, he told me. Let us make the first call. I agreed. 2 days later, I was checking hive frames when I saw Ethan pacing back and forth across his driveway with his phone pressed against his ear. Even from a distance, I could tell the conversation wasn't going well. He looked over at my place twice, then kicked one of his landscaping stones hard enough to send it rolling into the grass. I didn't know exactly what the inspector had said, but whatever it was, he'd heard the words federal investigation, and those words tend to humble people pretty quickly. A normal person probably would have stopped right there. Ethan doubled down instead. Over the next week, he called county zoning twice. An inspector came out, walked through my property with me, admired the bee yard, checked the setback distances, reviewed my exemption paperwork, and before leaving actually chuckled. "Somebody's wasting a lot of taxpayer money," he said with a grin. "You're cleaner than half the farms around here." I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched his truck disappear down the road. 15 minutes later, Ethan was standing at the fence. "You think this is over?" he shouted. I looked up from repairing a hive lid. I wasn't aware it had started. That answer seemed to bother him even more. "You're operating a business out here. I'm operating a farm. Same thing, not according to Kentucky law." He stared at me for a second before shaking his head. We'll see. I remember smiling because those two words usually mean someone has run out of facts and switched to hope. Around that same time, one of my oldest friends, Ben, stopped by with lunch. We'd served on opposite sides of lawsuits for years before becoming friends. And after I explained everything, he burst out laughing. "You know what's hilarious?" he said. "He's trying to prove you don't belong here while he's living in a house that literally depends on your property." I hadn't told him about the easement yet, so I pulled out the county file. Ben read the engineering drawings, whistled softly, and looked at me over the top of the pages. "He has absolutely no idea, does he?" "Not yet. What are you going to do?" I looked across the pasture where hundreds of bees drifted lazily through the summer flowers. "Nothing illegal," I said. "Nothing dishonest. I'm just going to make sure every decision from this point forward has a price attached to it." Ben nodded slowly because he understood exactly what I meant. A few days later, inspiration arrived from an unexpected place. One of the local beekeeping clubs invited me to demonstrate an educational observation hive for elementary school students. It was a clear acrylic display where people could safely watch bees working behind glass. Kids loved it because they could see the queen, the workers, the honeycomb, everything happening without disturbing the colony. After the demonstration ended, I loaded the observation hive into my truck, drove home, and stood looking at my old weathered mailbox that I'd replaced months earlier. It suddenly seemed like the perfect place for it. I mounted the observation hive securely inside the old mailbox housing, installed proper ventilation, transferred a small healthy colony into it, and placed the entire display beside my workshop where it was completely visible from the Harper's front windows, but nowhere near the active mailbox the Postal Service actually used. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't aggressive. It was fully compliant with state educational guidelines and agricultural regulations. Mostly, it was impossible to ignore. The following morning, Ethan walked outside carrying his coffee, spotted the bees moving behind the glass, and froze. Even from across the property, I could see the color drain from his face. Then came the phone. Then the photographs. Then the frantic pointing toward my fence while his wife folded her arms and simply stared. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. By sunset, I'd already received another voicemail from county officials asking whether I'd installed an educational observation colony. I returned the call, answered every question honestly, and the woman on the line laughed softly before saying, "You're perfectly within your rights, Mr. Cole." That was all I needed to hear. 3 mornings later, just after sunrise, I looked out my kitchen window and saw Ethan marching across the grass carrying a thick folder under one arm. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was desperate, and desperate people finally become willing to negotiate. He stopped a few feet from my porch and held that folder against his chest like it was some kind of shield. For the first time since we'd met, Ethan Harper didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a lecture about property values, zoning regulations, or what he thought good neighbors were supposed to do. He just stood there looking exhausted, the kind of exhausted that comes from finally realizing the world isn't required to cooperate with your assumptions. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded toward the chairs on the porch. "Sure." He sat down carefully, glanced toward the observation hive inside the old mailbox, and let out a slow breath. "The postal inspector came back," he admitted. "They suggested I retain an attorney." "That's usually good advice," I replied. He gave a dry laugh that lasted maybe half a second. "They also said opening someone else's mailbox isn't exactly a misunderstanding." "No," I said quietly. "It usually isn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The bees drifted lazily between the wildflowers. The breeze pushed through the maple trees behind the house, and it struck me how peaceful the property still was. None of that had changed. The only thing that had changed was the people standing on it. Finally, Ethan opened the folder and slid several papers across the table. "My attorney found something during title review." I looked down without touching them. I already knew what they were. Easement documents, engineering drawings, survey maps. "Looks like we need your signature." I nodded once. "Looks that way." He rubbed both hands together before speaking again. "The contractor said rerouting everything isn't really an option." I'm sure he did. "It would be expensive." I looked at him for a second before answering. "Actions usually are." He lowered his eyes. There wasn't any anger left in his voice now, only frustration. "What do you want?" That question sounds simple, but after years in law, I learned it's almost never about money. It's really asking where the damage stops. I stood, walked inside, and returned with a sealed envelope I prepared the night before. I placed it on the table between us. "Everything I want is in there." He opened it slowly. The first page outlined a private easement agreement. The second established a payment of $22,000 for permanent access across a narrow section of my property. The third required annual inspection rights to ensure no expansion occurred beyond the agreed area. The fourth was the one that held his attention. If he or anyone representing his household filed knowingly false complaints intended to interfere with my lawful agricultural operation within the next 10 years, the easement could be terminated under the agreement, subject to applicable law, forcing alternative engineering at their expense. He read that page twice, then a third time. $22,000, he finally asked. That's the value I placed on solving a problem I didn't create. He leaned back and stared out toward the fields. This feels personal. I smiled just a little. Actually, it's business. Personal would have looked very different. He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Would you take 12? I shook my head. No. 15? No. Can we negotiate? You already negotiated, I answered calmly. You just didn't realize you were doing it every time you opened my mailbox. He closed the folder without another word and walked back across the yard. 7 days passed. Then another black SUV rolled into my driveway. Only this time Ethan wasn't alone. His attorney stepped out first, followed by a local notary carrying a leather briefcase. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The attorney reviewed every page carefully, confirmed each clause had been voluntarily accepted, and nodded toward his client. Ethan signed first. His wife signed second. The certified check slid across the table toward me. $22,000. The notary stamped every document one by one, the sharp sound echoing across the porch like the closing of a courtroom door. As everyone gathered their papers, Ethan's wife finally spoke. It was the first full sentence I'd ever heard her say. I told him to leave your mailbox alone. There wasn't any anger in her voice, just disappointment. Ethan didn't respond. He simply picked up his copy of the agreement and walked back toward his truck. I watched them drive away until the dust settled over the gravel road. Life became surprisingly normal after that. No more anonymous county complaints. No more photographs from the fence line. No more late-night arguments drifting across the property. Every now and then I'd see Ethan mowing his lawn, and we'd exchange a brief nod. Not friendly, not hostile, just two neighbors who finally understood exactly where the boundaries were. The observation hive stayed inside that old mailbox. Kids from local schools occasionally visited to learn about pollinators, and every time they gathered around the glass watching thousands of tiny workers cooperate without arguing over territory or status, I couldn't help smiling at the irony. These never cared who had the bigger house. They never cared what car somebody drove or how expensive the landscaping looked. They simply respected the space that belonged to the colony and got on with the work that mattered. Funny enough, they ended up teaching my neighbors a lesson no courtroom ever could. Looking back now, I don't feel proud because I came out ahead financially. The money was never the real victory. The real victory was proving that patience beats arrogance far more often than anger does. If I had stormed across the property screaming the day I caught him opening my mailbox, this probably would have turned into another ugly neighborhood feud. Instead, I let the facts do the talking. And facts tend to speak louder than emotions when you give them enough time. So now I'm genuinely curious what you think. If someone repeatedly opened your mailbox trying to build a case against you, would you have confronted them immediately? Or would you have stayed quiet and waited until the truth caught up with them? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard both sides of this argument, and I'm honestly interested to see where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real neighborhood justice stories, and share this with someone who's ever had a neighbor who thought the rules only applied to everyone else.